and Michael Phillips, and they're going to give us some insights into the digital patient and innovation in clinical trials.
Thank you very much. We're certainly going to try. Michael and myself are part of the innovation team in ICON. And for those of you who don't know who ICON are, we're actually a really innovative success story, really an Irish success story. It started off 26 years ago with 2 people and has grown to an organisation of almost 12,000 people in 40 countries globally. So it really is a truly Irish success story. And what we're going to talk about today is really innovation in the area of clinical trials. And ICON has taken a very process approach to innovation. So it's not just people trying to come up with wonderful new ideas. It's actually setting challenges, identifying what the issues are, and putting in place a process around coming up with solutions. And we really crowdsource in terms of solutions around innovation. And I don't know how many of you here know anything about the pharmaceutical industry, but it's a very heavily regulated industry. And when drugs come on the market, they've gone through a very controlled process of clinical trials, so starting off with drug development and taking it all the way through a 4-stage process. And the reason innovation is required within clinical trials is over the last number of years, this process has become more labour intensive, more costly, and it's becoming longer and longer to get the drug from development, where it's developed, all the way through to, or where it's discovered rather, all the way through to the time it comes on the market. It can take anything up to 12 years for the drug to actually go from drug discovery to being launched on the market. You were talking, the gentleman from Nielsen's was talking about the number of failures within the industry. In clinical trials, only 2 of 10,000 drugs that are actually discovered make it to the marketplace. And it can cost up to $2 billion to get a drug on the market. And it's becoming more difficult, it's becoming more costly. Nowadays, drug companies, when they get the drug to the FDA, they then discover that they actually have to get the drugs passed through the payers. So there's another area where they need to get the drug through in order for their drug to be approved and for somebody to actually buy the drug. So it's becoming more and more difficult. And one of the key issues in drug trials is actually getting people to come into a drug trial, to find and recruit patients, and to actually keep them and retain them in the trial. I mean, you can imagine if you're sick and if you decide you want to join a trial, having to turn up at a site, 3 or 4 times a month, whatever, is actually very, very burdensome and very, very difficult. And this is one of the key areas for innovation within clinical trials. This is where the concept of the digitalized patient. Technology now exists where you can actually gather data around the patient's physical behaviours, their sleeping patterns, their physiological changes, and actually turn that into a digital signal. And that digital signal can be captured and used to try and identify the changes and the responses the patient has to therapy. And the potential for using wearable technology to transform clinical trials is actually huge. Okay? Before we go on to how the wearables can be used to digitalise the patient and how it can be used in clinical trials and the considerations around that, I just wanted to kind of circle back to you and just give you some little insights into clinical trials and the types of things that are needed. So a clinical trial is really around a hypothesis. So you're trying to pose a question to see if a drug actually does something significant. And in order to determine whether a drug does actually prove a hypothesis is correct or is not correct, you use something called outcome measures. And your primary outcome measure is really around the types of clinical solutions to try and identify whether or not the drug actually works. And that's quite important in terms of identifying what type of technology you might use to digitalize your patient. One of the issues around using wearables in clinical trials, from my perspective, is almost the proliferation of wearable technology. We're being inundated with all of this wonderful stuff that will measure our sleep, will measure our heart rate, will measure our oximetry, will measure our galvanic skin response. There's loads and loads of stuff out there. And sometimes, as professional researchers in this space, we almost get caught up with the clinical, with the actual technology itself, and we forget the fundamental clinical question we're trying to resolve and trying to solve. And that is the first thing that we need to consider when we're selecting wearable technologies in a clinical trial. It's not about the technology, it's about the clinical question. What is the question we're trying to address? The second thing we need to consider is the piece of wearable technology actually fit for purpose? Can it do what it's supposed to do? Are we trying to address a primary outcome measure? Are we trying to address a secondary outcome measure? Has the device been validated to actually give us the information we need? And I'll use a really simple example. So, hands up all of you who have fitness bands or wear a tracker, an activity tracker. And you see something called steps. So these things are fantastic for healthy people. They're fantastic motivators. And they will tell you how many steps you take. The difficulty is that if I am a chronically inpatient, and I'll demonstrate, and I don't step, so I shuffle and I don't step. So now, is my wearable validated to identify my shuffling, or will it only identify if I actually take a true step? And that's really significant. So if I'm using this technology as a way of identifying if a drug improves me and helps me be more active, and I'm using stepping, but actually I never step, I shuffle, then the device is not necessarily fit for purpose. We also have to look at the vendor. Is the vendor actually set up to supply a very highly regulated market? And in terms of data transfer, it's wonderful having all of this data generated, but how are we going to get it from the patient to our central monitoring system in such a way that conforms to the regulators, that actually conforms to all the privacy regulations, and that the data is actually transferred in a way that is validated, it can be quantified, it can be qualified, and can be verified. Before I finish my segment and hand over to Michael, who's actually going to go into much more detail about the data transfer piece, people are very excited about wearables. It's this brand new, we saw some slides today about this brand new phenomenon. But actually I would point out that wearable technology has actually been around since the 70s. And the first studies were done in researchers looking at the telemetric transfer of data from wrist-worn devices way, way, way back in the 70s. Probably some people in the audience here weren't born back in the 70s, but actually it's been around for a very, very long time. And so, in summary, innovation and disruptive innovation is going to come from this segment. It's about changing the concept of a clinical trial site, about the site being able to be around the patient and not necessarily somewhere where the patient has to travel to. But this is not without risk, it's not without consideration around the relevant endpoints we need to look at, around how much burden is on the patient, around all of the regulatory and data challenges, and most importantly, around making sure that the data we get is actually going to answer the clinical question we need to address to make sure the drugs are actually valuable and will make a difference to that particular patient. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Michael, who's going to talk to you about some pilot studies we've done in ICON to actually make sure that we can transfer the data from the device to central analysis.
Thank you, Marie. So that's all very interesting and really exciting in this industry, but how do we actually use these data that Marie talks about, having got over some of the burdens around understanding the devices and whether they are fit for purpose? So we did a couple of things. We started off by looking at a single vendor. So in this case, we were looking at an actigraphy device that was measuring a patient's activity or steps, as Marie was talking about. And these devices can do two things. They have built-in algorithms that will already give you an output, an endpoint essentially, in this case steps, and you're all very familiar with that idea from the devices you're wearing, even as consumer devices. But these devices are also capturing data at a very high granularity as well. The raw data, the 100 hertz data, literally every tenth of a second, 100th of a second, we're capturing data. Now those data are much too big to be using in a routine sense and not very interesting to most people. We wanted to capture both of these things. We wanted to be able to bring the endpoint data into our clinical data management system for routine use within the clinical trial setting, as Maria has described. But we also wanted to bring in the raw 100 hertz data as well for further research to see, could we start looking at patterns in the data. So we did this. In this case, this device was being worn by patients, measuring their activity, and then brought to a central hub. So this is, although the data are being collected from the patient remotely and in a mobile sense, the patient still has to go to some kind of center. They might be in their own home, but they're uploading that data into the vendor's cloud. We can then bring those endpoint data into our informatics hub, which we call Iconic, for analysis around the trial, but we're also capturing all that raw data in the cloud for subsequent analysis. And what can that raw data give us? Well, this is a really open-ended area of research right now, and lots of vendors are working on this, and ICON is interested in working on this. So that diagram at the top there, that image at the top, is the raw actigraphy data, a very small sample, because these data, as you can imagine, can get very big very quickly. But from those data, we can start applying pattern analysis to find, is there anything interesting in there that matches with some known event or some known phenomenon that the patient is exhibiting. And there are many applications of this down to actually being able to identify patients. It's obviously very important in a clinical trial setting that you can be sure that the patient who's been given this device to wear and whose data you're measuring is actually the person who's wearing the device, and they haven't given it to a family member or a friend to go jogging for them, let's say. So there are ways of trying to detect identity in these patterns. And then even more significantly, can we start looking at new digital biomarkers for particular indications in clinical trials and disease, particularly around central nervous system disorders. You can imagine how if you're trying to assess whether a drug is effective against Parkinson's disease, at the moment most of those assessments are based on questionnaires and assessing the patient in a kind of a clinical setting. But imagine if you could actually measure something objectively off the patient to see how their Parkinsonian tremors were varying as the drug was applied to them. So these kind of digital biomarkers are the kind of holy grail for a lot of the wearable research that's going on. So in this context, we can bring the endpoint data in for immediate use, but we can also store all this raw data in the cloud and at our leisure, so to speak, go back into it and see how we can find patterns, how those patterns relate to other information we have on those patients from the trial. But what about multiple devices? I mean, obviously it's an easy case when you're just using one device, but very often you might want to collect multiple kinds of data from a patient. And they could be quite varied. It could be actigraphy, but it could equally be ECG measurements or vital signs measurements. And you may have to cope with the idea that different vendors are involved, so you can't just use a single vendor to collect these data. So I'll just take you through this next slide in a few stages. We worked with a vendor that, if you like, consolidates these kinds of data into one place. So what it starts off with is, from our end, we provision a patient in their cloud system with an access token and a pretty anonymous user ID. We know back at base, in our secure data holding, these IDs correspond to certain patients, and we can match up all the demographic information, all the other clinical data that have been captured on the patient alongside that ID. So we know who they are, but Nobody else will. This is where Validic comes in. We give the patient then that access token through which they log into the Validic marketplace, as it's called. And Validic have already partnered with multiple device vendors. And the patient can then themselves authorize their particular device vendor to send their data to Validic. Once that's done, literally in real time, literally as the data are being collected from the patient, they're being sent from the individual vendor clouds into the Validic data store and stored there in a standardized data set or data structure, which can also be extended if you need to. And I should stress, this is not raw data, this is purely about capturing endpoint data for a clinical trial. But as you can see, it's very powerful in collecting from multiple vendors. And finally, there's a very, very well-developed public API that we can then capture all those endpoint data back into our systems. And as I said at the beginning, we now know that those endpoint data are being brought in, correlate with certain patients, we understand who they are. So we're being able to maintain this very de-identified, anonymous cloud solution for capturing all these endpoint data from multiple vendors. But when it comes back into ICON, it's in a standard form, and we can correlate all that data with our standard clinical data that we are capturing for that patient. So what are the applications of this? Well, first of all, this kind of solution gives you great data integration, analysis, and alerts. So you're literally capturing data in real time from your patients out there. They don't have to go to the hospital. Wherever they're doing their daily lives, you're capturing data relevant to the trial. And it's remote in real time. And with that information, as it comes into our informatics hub, we can do lots of different things. Risk-based monitoring is a way of, in a traditional clinical trial, you would visit the site at regular intervals to check everything is being collected. With risk-based monitoring, what you're doing is you're assessing which are the most reliable sites, which are the most reliable collection points, and tend to ignore those and focus on the ones that seem to be riskier. This allows you to have very, very proactive risk-based management of your trial. You can do safety monitoring. You can see immediately whether patients are in difficulty, if they're falling over, for instance, if that's relevant. You've got good protocol compliance. You can really assess whether the patients are wearing the devices, whether they're exceeding or not meeting certain activity standards, for example, or other compliance factors that the clinical trial protocol demands. You're engaging subjects better with these mobile devices, and also you can actually detect maybe whether a subject is falling off and losing interest, and therefore maybe intervene early to keep that patient in the trial. And finally, in extreme cases, you can even do fraud detection, as I said, to see whether the patient actually is using the device correctly and not some certainty. So I think it's a really powerful combination of all the things we already talked about, how wearables will transform clinical trials. But we also have to have this kind of data infrastructure and analytics behind it to make sense of all these data. And not least, the really exciting part is those raw data in the future where we can develop new clinical endpoints. Thank you.